You're listening to episode number 21 of the Nightingale podcast. I am so excited to share with you this week's episode as we chat with Amanda. She is the creator and owner of her business, the Resume RX. She is also a nurse practitioner. She is here today to answer some of your questions that you had put out there for us and just go over some really amazing information about resumes, cover letters, job negotiations, student loan repayment, and so much more. So you do not want to miss any moment of this week's episode. Before we dive in, I just want to thank you for tuning in to this week's episode. If you are loving the Nightingale podcast, please share it with a friend, and if you could leave me a rating and a review just to share with me what you're thinking of the podcast. I love getting suggestions for future episodes, and this is just a great way for us to land some amazing guests like the Resume RX and get the Nightingale podcast into as many hands as possible. So let's go ahead and dive on into this juicy episode. Hey friends, welcome to the Nightingale podcast, a podcast for nurses, future nurses, and, well, anyone interested in the nursing profession. I'm your host, Dakota Felkowski, RN, BSN, and DNP student. Join us each week as I interview nurses from all areas of the nursing profession to uncover nursing opportunities that you may have not known even existed. You can expect to be inspired and maybe even a little bit motivated. The goal of the Nightingale podcast is to encourage you to think outside of the box, step outside of that comfort zone of yours, and reach for a fulfilling and unique nursing journey. So let's dive in and check out this week's guest. You never know, they may just have your dream job. Hey, Amanda, welcome to the Nightingale podcast. I am so excited to have you here today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm super, super excited.
So this is going to be such a fun and interesting episode because we're doing things a little bit different. We are answering some questions that some listeners have and just going over some really important topics for the nursing profession or any profession in general. So this is going to be really fun. I can't wait.
Yeah, me too.
So I would love for you to kind of get started by telling us a little bit about yourself, about your business that you have, and just some things that you offer within your business.
Sure. Well, I am a nurse practitioner by trade. I graduated in 2011, and I am dual certified as an adult and women's health NP. And I work currently in emergency medicine, and I've been in that specialty for probably the last 5 years or so. And I'm a second degree nurse practitioner. So what that means is that I had a bachelor's degree in another field, and then I went back to grad school and did a more accelerated direct entry program. So when I decided to become a nurse, I knew that my end game was nurse practitioner. So that's kind of my clinical side of things. And my business and what we're going to talk about today is called the Resume RX. And essentially, I am a resume strategist, I guess you could call me, specifically for medical professionals and especially for nursing professionals. So I started this business over the summer when I saw a need for resume writing for nurses. I was on a Facebook group that I'm in, and someone had said, hey, does anyone know a resume writer, or can anyone give me some tips on how to write my CV? And this is always something that has come very natural to me. I have a strong interest in writing. So I kind of chimed into the conversation and gave some pointers that were very well received. And then I was just a little bit more aware of this. And so I kept seeing in different Facebook groups the same question pop up. And so the wheels got turning, and I said, well, I write resumes for myself that have been really effective and helped me land my dream job. So maybe I could try to do this for other people. So I did a whole lot of research. I did some free resume writing for some friends and some colleagues, and I started offering it as a service. So I offer custom resume and cover letter writing for medical professionals. So that's kind of one aspect of my business, but I took it a step further because I wanted to make this information really accessible to everybody, and I knew my time was only so limited. So what I did was I developed some resume templates that are downloadable, that are specifically for medical professionals, that have some prompts that people can fill in. And then I also have a website and an Instagram site where I just offer general resume tips, career advancement tips, because that's something that I'm just super passionate about, is helping medical professionals, specifically nurses, kind of craft the career and life of their dreams. So that's really where my passion lies. And this business has really afforded me to do that. So I'm really excited about it.
I absolutely love this for so many reasons. One of them being just that you saw this need, and it's such a different part of just the process, even of just graduating and making that transition to applying for jobs. And some of us don't probably feel like writing and doing that kind of stuff is our strong suit. So I love that you have both sides of that you can offer that medical background, because that isn't something that every person working on resumes has, is that they know this specific role and what they're looking for. So I absolutely love that you are filling this huge need, because it is such a daunting area when it comes time to writing your resume and applying for jobs.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's basically the one thing that every nursing professional needs, but that no one really likes to do.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm trying to empower people to kind of take it back into something that's enjoyable. I realize that hardly any of us learn how to do this in school, but it's really a crucial skill, because you have to sell yourself on paper before you can sell yourself in person. So it may seem like a formality to some people in the job search, but it's certainly a necessary formality, because you can't really advertise yourself to someone and try to get that job in person unless you've actually gotten the interview, and you need a stellar resume to get the interview. So
I love that. That's so true. It's funny because my husband actually is in the process of applying for pharmacy residencies, and he was just saying the same thing. He was really stressing, and he said, you know what, they do put a lot of emphasis on these CVs and these resumes, because they do have to weed out so many applicants, and they can't interview every single person that applies for a position, a residency, a internship. So it is so true that you have to make that initial impression with this piece of paper. So I love that we are going to give some help to the listeners on this topic.
yes, for sure.
So I just want to make sure, so everyone can work with you one-on-one and through your website. Is that correct?
Yeah. So I offer one-on-one options for people who want it completely done, start to finish. But for someone who wants a more DIY type of option and wants to learn how to write their own resume, I have a lot of resources on my blog and the downloadable templates to make that happen as well.
Oh, how convenient. I love that. Perfect. And again, it's just for everyone at every phase, correct? So if you're a new grad, as someone with a long, extensive work history, someone who maybe is a student and is kind of building up their resume.
Yes, absolutely. I tend to work with a lot of new graduates just because it's such uncharted territory for them. But there are plenty of people that I work with who have been professionals for many years and for whatever reason are going through a job change or a move or a transition. So certainly there's something that everyone can learn from the information that I put out there, for sure.
Perfect. So let's kind of dive on in. We do have a few questions that actually some of our listeners had asked that you have come up with some great answers for. I'd like to kind of get started with just giving us a general rundown of some pointers and tips and things to look out for when you are writing your actual resume.
Yeah, so the first, there are plenty of tips. We could probably stay on this call for a long time, but a couple things that I think are super important. The first thing is to make sure that your resume looks visually appealing. And I don't mean that it has to look fancy or have fancy fonts or colors, but, it should be, your name should be kind of big across the top. You should have a subheader that says what you are, whether you're a student nurse or a new graduate or a nurse practitioner. And then it should be well organized, and whatever organizing style you decide, it should be consistent throughout. So something that I talk about a lot is consistency in a resume. So making sure your font size is the same and your font style is the same and your spacing is the same, and you don't have spelling errors or grammatical errors, because those types of things show attention to detail. So just for example, if you're talking about a job that's your current job, you should be writing in the present tense. Whereas if you're talking about a job that's a previous job, you should be writing in the past tense. So that's kind of an example of those fine level details that may not seem significant, but can make a big impact. And the next thing that I tell everybody to use on their resume is something called a professional summary. And I talk a lot about that. Traditionally, this is called the objective section. Like if you look at some old resume templates that you can find on Microsoft Word, there'll be a little objective section. And people write this section and say, my objective is to expand my foundation of pediatric nursing at such and such hospital, which is great. But my soapbox, so to speak, is to flip that. And rather than saying what your objective is, it's to write something called a professional summary or a professional profile and really outline what you can do for your employer. Because at the end of the day, the person who's reading your resume, they'll appreciate what you want to do in terms of your career objective, but they really want to know how you're going to serve them, how you're going to kind of enhance their institution, their hospital, their organization. So I advertise it kind of like an elevator pitch or a mini cover letter or a highlight reel. And it's basically something that's highly personalized and tailored to the job that you're applying to. And I feel like that's the first thing that people are going to read. And if you do that well, you can really set yourself up for success. And I have an in-depth blog post all about that on my website at theresumérx.com/summary. And I even have some fill-in-the-blank templates that you can plug in your own information to craft your own professional summary.
Ooh, that is so good. I've never thought about that, but that is so true. That's why the job is posted, because they are seeking a need to be filled. So that I love that.
Yeah, absolutely. You can really make a big impact when you show what you have to offer to a position beyond just what is in it for you. And I think that once you approach that with that shift in perspective, it can make a really powerful difference.
Oh, perfect. So one of our first questions from one of our listeners has to kind of do with kind of going through into your job history. So their question is a large gap without work seen as a concern?
So this is a very common question, especially among women who tend to have more employment gaps because of child rearing and that type of thing. So I think that the employment gap, it depends really on the reason. And because we're in a predominantly female position, I feel as though the gaps for raising children are much more widely accepted. But what you really have to decide is whether or not, first of all, you want to disclose it on your resume. Some people just choose to put the dates, and then if they're asked about it during an interview process, then they can get into it at that time, explain what the gap was for. And or some people decide to specifically address it either in that professional summary section or in their cover letter if they think that it's appropriate. For example, if they had more than a 5 or 10 year gap in employment, and if it's for some other reason that they want to address, you can address it. I usually say to just put the dates and kind of wait to be asked about it, especially if it's for something like a health reason or something that you're really not obligated to disclose. And I think that pretty much anything that we perceive as a negative about ourselves, we can turn it into a positive. So, the positive of someone who's had a gap of employment, they could easily say in an interview that they've had time away from their job and they're eager to get back in and learn, and they're as enthusiastic as they were when they were a new graduate. So I think that whatever could be perceived as a negative, as long as you have a positive spin to put on it, I wouldn't worry about it.
Oh, I love that. That is so good to hear, because I think that is a common, even if it's not a gap, but even just saying that about things that we perceive as negative, that we can flip those around and we don't have to portray it to them as a negative. And that if we're thinking it, maybe we should just say, why is this a positive that this has happened? I have kind of a question to go along with this that I didn't really prepare you for, but so one of my questions is that sometimes we are in positions for a short time, and I've had this where I've started a couple positions and I haven't been there very long. It didn't really work out. It wasn't what I thought it would be, so I left in a short time. Do you, and I always feel like I should leave those off, or I feel awkward putting those on there. What is your kind of thought on that?
I was thinking about this the other day because I saw this come up in another discussion. My thought is, I believe in honesty, and I think that your resume should accurately portray your work history. That said, if it was a bad situation or like a really short period of time or something really negative, I think it's okay to leave it off and perhaps bring it up verbally in person. I would just hate to be on the other end as the employer and find that there was a job that was hidden, that was not disclosed. So I feel like if you disclose it in some way, perhaps waiting to disclose it in the in-person interview as opposed to putting it on the resume, I think that that's a fine solution. But I mean, if it was a job that was 6 months or more, I would say definitely to keep it on. And maybe if it were less than 6 months, to kind of reevaluate whether or not to include it on paper and then decide whether to instead address it in person.
I love that. That is really helpful because I think too, I've had where I haven't put it on there and then I go to answer a question in an interview and some of the experience I had there is relevant. So then it's kind of hard to try and backpedal and be like, oh, well, I'm talking about this position that I didn't put on my resume, so it's hard for them to follow. But some of the experience I've had there is good and it's good to share. Is like, for example, I worked in a ER. I was applying for an ER and had done a short time as like a transport nurse. So that I left off because I wasn't there very long, but it definitely was very relevant. So I'm sure you would agree that you have to kind of pick and choose based on too, is the experience relevant to that position that you're applying for?
Yeah, for sure. I think experience is experience, and most experience can be, like we were talking about before, flipped into a positive way in some way. So really the only negative of any experience is if you were there for a short time, and that's kind of the perception, either the perception that you place on that situation or the perception that the hiring manager does. But I think that there's still a way to say, hey, this is something that I did. This is why it didn't work out. It wasn't what I was passionate about, or there was some other reason why it didn't work out. But here are the things that I learned that I will take with me as I move forward. So I think that can still be a positive experience if you frame it as such.
Oh, so good. Okay, awesome. Love it. Okay, so any other tips or anything that you want to mention about resumes?
Let's see. Other tips about resumes. People sometimes ask me how far back to include information. So this kind of is along the same lines of whether or not to include a short position. And I think that it's a good idea to include as much that is relevant going back. For example, new graduates will ask if they should include things that aren't relevant, even though they haven't had any other healthcare related experience. That's a big question that I get all the time. Like, should I include the job that I had at this retail environment because I don't have anything else to put under work experience? And I think that I usually encourage people, if that position has something to offer in the realm of customer service or another aspect that can be applicable to nursing, to go ahead and include it. Otherwise, to focus on kind of volunteer experiences, clinical rotations, that type of thing.
Okay, perfect. I love that. I could see that as being a very common question. So that's very helpful. Friends, starting a new position is scary. It's frightening, it's overwhelming, it's exciting, it's all of the things. I know, I've started many new positions in my time as an RN. But really, it doesn't have to be as difficult as we try to make it. Through these experiences, I have gathered 5 tips to starting a new position and making that transition as smooth as possible. I have created a free guide for you as my listeners to make this transition as seamless as possible and allow you to really excel in your new position. So if you recently started a new position, you are going to start a new job, or you know someone who's going to start a new position. I mean, come on, you have to fall into one of those 3 categories. Then head on over to thenightingalepodcast.com to sign up to receive your 100% free copy of the 5 tips PDF. I'm here to support you through all your new ventures in your careers, and I believe these 5 tips are going to do just that. So head on over to thenightingalepodcast.com after this episode and download your free guide. I mean, come on, what do you have to lose? So let's kind of switch gears here and talk a little bit about the cover letter and just what your suggestions are with that. I know a lot of positions really, especially when you're going through that application process, having that cover letter, wanting you to have something there. So what are your tips or recommendations for going about that?
Yeah, so there's always a common question, first of all, do I need a cover letter? Are they necessary? What do I include in it? And I think the first thing is to make sure that whatever job you're applying for, read the directions. If the job posting requests a cover letter, make sure that you're including one. If the job posting just says a resume, that to me says that it's cover letter optional. And a cover letter can be something that's kind of in its own document, uploaded as a cover letter. Or if you're sending your resume via email, you can always put your cover letter, quote unquote, in the body of the email, in which case I call it a cover email, but it's really the same type of content. The thing about the cover letter is it's easy to kind of go on and ramble about what you've done without being really clear and succinct about what you can potentially bring to a position. So similarly, in what I recommend for professional summary, I strongly encourage that the cover letter should really be framed from the perspective of how you're going to enhance this organization or hospital or clinic to which you're applying. So I kind of have a framework that I recommend where I recommend using at least 3 paragraphs. And the first paragraph I call the personal and passionate paragraph. So essentially that's the place where you introduce yourself, you bring up something memorable or something that has ignited your passion for your profession, and you talk about that in the first paragraph. So you could say something to the effect of, ever since I was a patient when I was 12 years old, I have been really inspired to go into the field of pediatric oncology or something to that nature. So you're kind of making a memorable statement so that you're keeping the reader reading, essentially. And once you've introduced yourself in that paragraph, the second paragraph is where I say to put your achievements and your aptitude. And so what I encourage you to write there is to talk about what you've done thus far. So if you're a new graduate, you can talk about your academic achievements or your achievements in your clinical rotations. And if you're an experienced nurse or nurse practitioner, you can talk about anything that sets you apart from your nursing colleagues. So not just your basic nursing skills, but perhaps a project that you spearheaded or a recognition award that you got, something of that nature. And then your aptitude. So your especially for new graduates, when you don't necessarily have a lot of accomplishments to showcase, you can say how you are an excellent learner, that you take direction, that you're an enthusiastic team player, these types of things, to kind of showcase how apt you are to go into a new position easily. And then the third paragraph is where you show your value and seal the deal. So it's kind of a summary paragraph where you talk about how excited you are about the position, how you're confident that you can bring X, Y, and Z to the organization. And then the seal the deal paragraph is basically where you ask for the next step. So you could say something to the effect of, I look forward to discussing with you further how we can both work together to improve the outcomes of the oncology patients at whatever hospital, for example. So I think following that framework is a really solid way to have an effective cover letter without being too lengthy, too wordy, and too rambling.
That is so helpful because I think too that it is really like you're so focused on that resume and then they ask for the cover letter. And I feel like every time I've gone to apply for jobs, that's definitely an afterthought. And I'm like trying to scramble to write it. So it's so nice to have that framework to just go and you say, okay, I know what I need to say in each of these 3 paragraphs. And 2, it's that kind of preview into why should they look at your resume. And so that is so helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think another big tip is to write your resume first and to write the whole body of your resume first, then write your professional summary section at the top of the resume, and then go ahead and write your cover letter. And those last 2 sections, the summary and the cover letter, should really be highly tailored to the job that you're applying to. So rather than having something very generic, you're going to be saying, "Dear so-and-so," if you have a name, or "Dear hiring manager," or "Dear nursing recruitment," and you're going to talk about how, you're expressing interest in this position and how, you are enthusiastic about this hospital and this organization, as opposed to making it very generic, because that just shows that you've gone the extra step to not just photocopy a whole bunch of the same resume and cover letter and apply to a million jobs. It really shows that you have specific interest in this position, and that's going to go a long way with the hiring manager or the recruitment team.
Love it. That is so good. I love that. Especially too, I think going with that is just, I've applied for quite a few jobs and I've had, obviously you update your resume and you add to it or whatever as you go on, but making sure you remember to go back and change it when you're applying to jobs and not accidentally submitting it with the wrong information, like the wrong person it's addressed to or the wrong position type. I don't know if you've seen that or not, but
I have seen that, like on the other end, being the person reading the resumes in a job setting, and it's very off-putting. It takes a lot to then convince you to move forward when there's that small but major mistake.
Right. And like you said, it shows attention to detail and it shows that you're really like, this isn't just a formality that you're just going through and applying to every single job that's open out there. It shows that you actually really want this specific job and why you would fit for this position.
Absolutely.
So we can kind of move forward now. You have submitted your applications. You have gotten the job offer. Congratulations. Now here's the hard part we forget about. We just want to go in and be like, oh, yay, I got the job. I accept your offer, whatever it may be. We don't even think about it. A lot of thought needs to kind of go into if you need to negotiate, can you negotiate? So what are your thoughts on negotiating once you have that job offered to you?
Yeah, so I think that it's a little bit different for nurses versus NPs. So I'll try to break that down a little bit. I think that the hardest place to negotiate is when you're an employee, either nurse or nurse practitioner of a big hospital, and you're actually employed by the hospital. The reason being, a lot of those have nursing departments who have a set pay scale. So you may be coming into, someone who's literally matching up your years of experience and your degree on a grid, and that's your starting pay, no questions asked. So just kind of be prepared for that. And if you're in a bigger setting, if you're not in a bigger setting, and even if you are and you want to negotiate, you have to do your research first. So you need to know what the standard is for your specialty, for your degree, and for your geographical area. There are a couple tools. Salary.com is a good one, and Glassdoor.com are 2 places where you can kind of input some data and find out what the average salary is depending on your degree and your geographical area. So that's some place to research. And so you just want to go in and be prepared and say, would you consider a starting salary of X? It appears that new graduates in my area have an average salary of whatever. So is there any room for negotiation there? there may or may not be. And if there's a no, if you get a no for salary, don't be afraid to try to negotiate other things. So you could ask for additional PTO. You could ask for a continuing education allowance or an increase if you already get one. You could ask for a one-time sign-on bonus. You could ask them to waive the vesting period for your retirement account. Basically, for the most part, all benefits are kind of on the table. So I don't think that anyone is then going to step back and say, actually, we don't want you for this position at all if you attempt to negotiate. But just know that if there are certain things that are deal breakers for you, you have to be prepared to walk away from the position. For nurse practitioners, if you have already been in the position and you want to ask for a raise, or if you're coming from a previous position, you should gather some data about your productivity and highlight what you've contributed to the practice, either the current practice if you're asking for a raise, or your previous practice if you're negotiating a new position. And if you have those statistics, you can kind of do some math based on average insurance reimbursements and also the overhead of the clinic and of your other benefits, and try to figure out what your salary is and maybe where there's still some wiggle room that wouldn't cost the clinic a large amount of money. You'll probably have more negotiation power in a private practice setting. And if a salary bump is turned down, like if you try to negotiate and they say no and you decide to accept the position anyway, you can always ask for a salary review after a certain period of time, say 6 months, or some sort of built-in salary restructuring based on your productivity after you've been trained. Because especially for nurse practitioners, salary is so closely linked to your productivity. And a lot of employers are going to lose money on you in the first 3 months when you're on orientation because you're not going to be actually making money for the clinic yet. So it can be difficult to kind of go into a first position and say, hey, I want this much more, when you haven't really, you don't really have the data to support that you can earn that much more. Because at the end of the day, from the clinic's perspective or from the employer's perspective, this is all kind of profit and loss business math. So it may not be that they don't want to offer you more, but they may not be able to because of their, how they're balancing their budget. So if it's a hard no, I would say try to negotiate other things, non-salary benefits, and then attempt to have a reevaluation of your salary or some sort of review after a period of time to discuss your productivity and whether your salary can be adjusted at that point.
That is so helpful. I'm going through this actually right now with my NP transitioning into the NP role and interviewing for positions and accepting. So I think that a lot of people do go through, you just don't know what you can ask for. So I think that was very helpful. One interesting thing that I read, and I want to kind of hear your thoughts on this, is that nurse practitioners are being utilized more and more, and some practices, you might be the first nurse practitioner to work in that clinic or with a certain provider. So I kind of had heard it is so important if you feel like you have a very low salary or you're not getting compensated as you should be, even just as a profession, to make sure that you do speak up. And just because going forward, you are kind of laying the groundwork for future nurse practitioners and advanced practice nurses, that if you aren't willing to kind of step up and ask for that raise when it's necessary or when it's earned, you're setting up for the future to not get paid and compensated as well as we should be. So what are your thoughts on that? Do you see that as something that we need to continue to work on as the profession is utilized more and more?
I completely agree with you. I think that, asking for salary increases and just kind of talking about the business side of things in general is a way that we can advocate for ourselves, but also advocate for our profession. And especially when there is, a pay gap still with men and women, which is a whole discussion beyond the scope of this podcast. But I think that, we're in a very female-dominated profession, and as such, I feel like we need to work extra hard to make sure that we are proving our worth from the business side of things and advocating for ourselves as opposed to being taken advantage of. Because I think that as nurses, and especially as nurturing people, I think that many of us kind of fall into that category of, going above and beyond and saying yes to everything and kind of being a little bit submissive. And I'm not saying that in a bad way. I think that that's just kind of a characteristic that many of us probably identify with. And all the more reason for us to kind of take that back and instead advocate for ourselves to move forward professionally. And also, like you said, lay the groundwork for our future colleagues.
Yes. And I love what you said too about just having that data to back it up. Once you get in, like you said, if you're not getting that salary that you want, once you get started, then you can use those numbers to say, hey, look at what I'm adding. Look at the value I'm adding to this practice. Look at the revenue that's being generated by my practice. And then you kind of have some negotiating power behind you.
For sure. And, it's not an emotional discussion. And I had to I've told myself that a few times when I've gone into negotiating discussions. And I've ultimately, there was a position I considered not too long ago that I turned down 3 times because of inability to negotiate. They wouldn't kind of meet me where I needed them to, essentially. And I just had to remember, as difficult as that was for me, because I'm so non-confrontational by nature, I had to remember, like, this is not an emotional discussion. This is a business discussion. It's not that I feel that I deserve this amount of money. It's that I know that I'm worth this amount of money based on my talent and productivity and experience. And when you just kind of lay it out that way, and think about it as a non-emotional conversation, it makes it a little bit easier.
Oh, that's such good advice. I love that. What is your for someone who is kind of going in, you talked about having that data behind you, but I know it can be kind of somewhat daunting, like you said, to go and ask for this. How do you, is there a wording or a style of communication that you suggest using when you're going and asking for this or making that negotiation as to not sound like you're not grateful for them offering the position or that you're not interested? What is your take on that?
Yeah, so I think that if it's in a job that you already have, I think that it's probably, you can either, ask for a special meeting with whoever your supervisor is or wait for your evaluation time, and just kind of say, you can use the compliment sandwich, which is how I pretty much do everything, and say, how much you love the position, how much you enjoy working with your patients, and you feel that you've had a very productive year over the past 1 year, as evidenced by data. Can we discuss, salary adjustments, that type of thing? For the most part, I hope that you'd be in a position where every year there's some sort of not only cost of living salary adjustment, but hopefully a market adjustment as well. I work for a big academic hospital, and probably every year we get a cost of living wage adjustment. And then about every other year, we also get a market adjustment where they kind of look at the average NP salary in the region and adjust our salaries appropriately. So in my current job, I've never really felt the need to say, hey, I need more than what I'm getting for that reason. But when you're approaching a new position and wanting to negotiate there, I usually, again, use the compliment sandwich and be very gracious for the offer, and let them know that you've seriously considered it and that you've looked into the entire compensation package. And I think that also, as a side note, before you negotiate salary, make sure you're looking at the entire benefits package, because as much as we can get caught up in the number of, the annual salary, I think it's also important to consider retirement benefits and these other things that sometimes we think about later. But, if an employer is going to give you, for example, a 10% retirement contribution without you even needing to put in anything, like not even a match, if they're going to give you 10%, you should consider that into your bottom line, because that's 10% of your salary as free money every year that goes towards retirement. So before you negotiate, show them that you've considered the entire package. And if you have a current hourly rate, let them know what it is and how you need to, meet or exceed that hourly rate for it to be worth your while making the switch, for example, or outline other benefits that you get. Say, currently this is what I get, or currently this is the expectation of, my profession in the area. Can you meet me at this? And give them a concrete, currently I receive 5 weeks of vacation annually. Can you match that? Or currently I get, whatever percentage retirement contribution. Can you match that? Or could we discuss the possibility of a 40-hour-a-week position closer to the X dollar per hour rate? And you can use, hourly rate or annual salary, whichever they're structuring the salary at. And then just leave it open. Say, I'd love to discuss this further with you. I'm free whatever day and time, so that we can connect. I usually, as you can tell, this sounds more like a letter or an email, because usually I think that it's good to have this discussion in writing, so that you can prepare the other person for your questions and then set up a time to meet face-to-face to discuss them.
Oh, that's helpful. That is so good. Thank you so much for answering that, because I think that it is really hard to know what's the best way to go about that and to just not feel like super uncomfortable when you're going in. So I think that gives people a really good idea of what to prepare for when this is something they're thinking about. So one other question that one of our listeners had was, can you negotiate student loan repayment if not offered in the job description?
So I think that it does not hurt to ask. No one would ever fault you to ask. If you're, and it kind of depends on your setting, whether or not it's something that your employer is actually going to offer you. I think that you could potentially ask a private practice to negotiate student loan repayment, because I'm thinking that there's probably some tax benefits to them as a business. You may end up negotiating a lower salary in exchange for that. I'm not exactly sure how that would look like. You can definitely, ask for it, because it's not unheard of for some jobs to offer that. But you should also consider that there are other student loan repayment options in case that's a no. So just for an example, my big inner city hospital did not offer any loan repayment options. However, they are in an area, in a zip code that has a high health provider shortage area score. So I actually qualified for a loan repayment option through Nurse Corps, which you may or may not have heard of. And I can go into those details if you want, but just because the employer won't offer it doesn't mean that you can't get it from another source, depending on where you work.
Yeah. Okay. And so I would love for you to kind of go into what you have to offer for the student loan repayment, because I know that is something advice that you offer within your business. So I would love to have you kind of go through a little bit about that.
Sure. So the majority of these student loan repayment options are going to be government programs. So there's the National Health Service Corps as one, which is something that offers both a scholarship and a loan repayment program. The scholarship is something that you apply for while you're in school, and they pay for school while you're studying in exchange for a service time after you graduate at a particular site. The National Health Service Corps also has a loan repayment program where if you're employed at one of these sites, usually they're at federally qualified health centers or Bureau of Prisons, or there are some other things that qualify. You can then apply to be a recipient of the loan repayment program if that site qualifies. And there's on the National Health Service Corps website, I think there's a zip code search where you can see all the sites that have been earmarked as official NHSC sites. So that's one option. The second option, which is the one I mentioned that I did, is called Nurse Corps, and that's spelled CORPS. And that's also a government program that is specifically for nurses. They have an RN branch, an advanced practice branch, and a nurse faculty branch. And it's not a merit-based scholarship, so you don't have to apply with an essay or anything like that. It's solely determined by your debt-to-income ratio. So, for example, if you have an income of $50,000 a year and you owe $50,000 in loans, that's a 100% debt-to-income ratio. So it's determined on that, and then based on your workplace, the health provider shortage area code. So a lot of inner city places qualify for this. And that's something that has an application cycle once a year. And if you're awarded the scholarship, you get something like 60% of your total loan balance, and they pay it to you monthly over the span of 2 years. So you have to be employed full-time for 2 years at the site. And I think there's an option to extend for a third year. The third one, which is something that's been a little bit more in the media lately, is public service loan forgiveness. And that is for federal student loans only. And basically you have to have your employment, you have to work in a public service role or at a nonprofit organization. So the majority of nonprofit clinics or hospitals are going to qualify for this. And you have to make 120 payments, on-time payments, while working full-time. So if you have no breaks in your employment, that's exactly 10 years of full-time employment. You have to get your employment certified every year, basically by someone in HR saying that, you know, you work in this position and that you were employed for the whole year, and it just has to be notarized. And then at the end of 10 years, after you've made 10 years of payments, the remainder is forgiven. And usually you have to participate in an income-based repayment program to qualify for this, which basically is when your payment adjusts based on how much money you make. So if you're starting off with a low income, your payment is going to be a low percentage of your income, regardless of how much debt you have. So there's been a little bit of chatter in the media about whether or not this is going to be a good option, because it's like the first few years of people since this program was implemented are now coming to the 10-year mark. And from what I've heard, a lot of them have been declined, either from not following the rules appropriately or having very small details missed in their paperwork. So I can't speak to how great of a program that is because I don't actually know of anyone yet who's successfully had the remainder of the loans forgiven. But those are the three big options that I know of for nurses: the National Health Service Corps, Nurse Corps, and public service loan forgiveness.
That is so helpful. I thank you so much for going through that, because I love that you said that it's not always, there are other options out there besides just your employer. And when you do get into these big health systems, which we're seeing a lot of mergers and things like that, a lot of them don't offer repayment options. So it's so good to know that you have something out there. And we're so fortunate to be in a field that they do want to offer us some type of repayment because we are working in that field.
Yes, absolutely. And the only other thing that I forgot to mention is that if you took out something called a Perkins loan, I'm fairly certain that all Perkins loans are forgivable after 5 years of full-time employment as a nurse or nurse practitioner. So if any of your loans are Perkins, you can defer them through your lender by certifying your full-time employment, and then basically a portion of like 20% of it gets canceled each year. And after 5 years, it's all gone. So that's another option.
Awesome. And so do you suggest all of these options, are they something that you recommend people can you apply for them prior to graduation, or do you have to apply after you have already gotten into the position that you are in?
So the National Health Service Corps scholarship is something that you have to apply for in school. But the other ones, you have to be in a position first. So if you're someone who has a really high loan burden, I would say to just kind of plan on trying to find a position that is either a certified loan repayment site or something that's in a high healthcare provider shortage area, because that will make you a more competitive candidate for these loan repayment options. So that would be my best advice, especially if you're in that category where you are probably going to have a debt to income ratio of more than 100%. If when you accept your first salary, if it's less than what you owe in student loans, then that's a big red flag. Then you should try your best to find some sort of loan repayment option, or else you'll unfortunately be feeling like you're paying back those loans forever. And take it from someone. I just paid my student loans off in August, and I was someone who had a lot of resentment for my job because I would work a lot of overtime, but all the overtime would go to pay my loans. And I felt like I was working to pay back the money I took out to get the job that I was in. And it really was not good for my morale in my position. And now that I have paid off those loans, I know that the money I earn is my money, and I'm so much happier at work.
Oh, I bet. I could totally see that. That is going to be really helpful. Especially I'm even so excited to start researching everything you talked about. So, thank you so much.
Oh, of course.
So, I want to hear if there's anything else any advice or any recommendations that you have for people who are going through this process, either with benefits, resumes, cover letters, job negotiations, student loan repayment, any other last minute kind of advice or things that you want to add.
I would just say to just keep an open mind through this whole process, especially if you're a new graduate. These topics are not entirely exciting for people, but they make a big difference because they're going to set you up to be happy in your career and potentially, a good earner. A lot of these things, benefits, salary negotiation, while they can be daunting, they ultimately equal money and potentially, your success in your position. So have an open mind. If there's something that you don't understand, especially in the benefits realm, reach out to someone and figure it out, or Google, or reach out to me or somebody, find a professional mentor, because it's easy to say, oh, this is too overwhelming, I'm just not going to deal with it. And that can really affect you negatively. And in terms of resumes, one of my number one tips is to just keep something updated. Even if you're not in the market for a new position, once a year, just go through and update everything, because then it won't be a daunting task when you do need it for either a new position or some sort of work review or portfolio or something. So just don't be afraid of it and familiarize yourself with it, and it'll be a much more enjoyable and less scary experience.
Love that. I don't know how many times I've gone to update and then I'm like, oh gosh, what did I do? So I love that tip. So I want you to just make sure you let everyone know how they can reach out to you, how they can find you on social media, how they can find you on your website, and just any kind of last minute things about your business and your offerings.
Yeah, so I am primarily on Instagram. That's where I hang out the most. So you can find me at the Resume RX. And I have lots of stories, and I have a couple fun projects starting in 2019 in terms of career exploration. So go ahead and follow me over there. And my blog and my website, which has more information about general tips. It has my resume templates and everything that's available kind of in my shop, and also content-wise. That's on my website, which is just theresumerx.com.
Love it. Thank you so much for joining us today. This seriously is so helpful, and I cannot wait for everyone to hear just the different ways that you can do your resume, and just so many different things we don't always think about when we are starting that job search or starting to accept offers. So this is very beneficial. Thank you so much.
Oh, I'm so glad. It was really my pleasure.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the Nightingale Podcast. If you enjoyed this week's episode, make sure you subscribe so that you are getting weekly notifications when the new episode comes out. And while you are there, I would really appreciate you leaving a review, and maybe your review will be featured on an upcoming podcast. You can check out all episodes at thenightingalepodcast.com or on Facebook at The Nightingale Podcast.